John's heading straight to the airport at 2 o'clock. I'll keep this introduction shorter than I otherwise would, because there's so much could be said about John. He and I met, I think for the first time in 1988, and it was at the conference on hunting and gathering societies that was held in Darwin. And John's mentor, or one of John's mentors, and one of my mentors were respectively Nick Peterson and Harvey Feit. And there was a brand of Canadian and Australian anthropology which was emerging, an engaged anthropology based really on the strong parallels of the evolution of Indigenous rights in Canada and Australia that brought together generations. And I think to this day, some of the distinguishing qualities of Canadian and Australian anthropology have to do with the prominence of decolonization efforts, Indigenous rights in general, conservation approaches to conservation of Indigenous territories. John is a research professor now at Deakin University, Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalization. He was, for most of his career, at the Australian National University and was founding director of the Centre for Aboriginal Economic Policy Research, which was another connection that brought us together, because I was a visitor there in my early years at McGill. John has an academic background in economics, and both of us were working on Aboriginal economic systems in those years, me in northern Quebec with Cree people, and John in the northern territory of Australia. He has had a remarkably productive career. I think I counted about 200 publications in the last 20 years. He's well recognized. He was elected a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia in 2003, and in 2012 became an honorary fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand. And I learned that John grew up largely in New Zealand. He has worked not only in the Northern Territory, that's been his sort of principal venue, but he also has worked in Northern Queensland, in Torres Strait, where both Monica and I have worked, in the Kimberleys in Central Australia. That's a very brief and rapid overview, but a very warm welcome to an old friend and very special colleague.
Thank you very much, Colin, and it's terrific being here to present the seminar. As you'll see, it's not one of my more cheerful presentations in terms of content. But these are issues that need to be addressed. I would like to acknowledge the traditional landowners and residents of the city in accord with the practice we have in Australia of recognising traditional owners. And this seminar is, it's not straightforward, and I will try and chart the pathway in the time I have available. I have given it once or twice before, and it's taken me a long time to present it. But today I'll try and do it in at the latest by 1:30, so we have half an hour for questions and discussion, if that's acceptable. The title is there: Genocide and Intervention. Contemporary, what's my title? Contemporary Indigenous Australia, Raphael Lemkin Down Under. And I'll get to the the couching of my argument in terms of Lemkin's theories. A subtitle could be or clearing the land of homelands as spaces of hunter-gatherer subjectivity today. So let me begin with just a brief vignette. Over the last 2 to 3 years, whenever I visit Kuninjku people living in the town of Maningrida in Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory, they tell me they're hungry. Sometimes we have to get some food from the store before we sit down to do some serious work together. This is something that I've experienced before when people lived at tiny bush communities called outstations or homelands on their land. But then they were empowered to do something about their hunger. They could go and fish or hunt or gather food. I'm saddened but not surprised when people who are proud hunters in the bush tell me this, that they're hungry. Logic suggests that if people are looking to live on welfare, buying food from the community stores where prices are extraordinarily high, they will struggle. This is especially so for those in imposed and compulsory workfare who regularly lose some of their income support for non-attendance and make work programs or training for training's sake. That people struggle to have money for food is a disgrace in a rich first world nation like Australia. It suggests careless administration of program reform or careless 21st century aims of elimination. Now, I've looked to highlight this situation in the mainstream media. Just last December, I appeared on an Australian Broadcasting Commission radio program aptly called Life Matters, and I was debating the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, the Senator Nigel Scullion. He refuted my first-hand observations as well as the words of my Kuninjku friends and collaborators of 38 years, instead invoking his higher authority as someone who has visited 150 communities in remote Australia and information on store sales provided to him by employees of a government-supported retail network to tell listeners that any emotive talk of mine about hunger was just that. It was just emotive. So let me just give you an outline of my argument. This seminar is work in progress, using the frame of Raphael Lemkin's cultural genocide that I've never seriously engaged with until this year. I want to look at an unusual form of settlement in post-colonial Australia called homelands or outstations, tiny hamlets that sit at the very bottom of the size-sensitive settlement hierarchy. Here I will just refer to these places as homelands, in part to connote that they are almost invariably located on Indigenous titled lands, in part because I want to find an adjective for the residents of these places, and homelanders is probably as good as I can get in a single English word. The crux of my argument is this. Over time, many Indigenous Australians living in remote, uninvaded parts of Australia, and I put that in inverted commas, this is the legal fiction of uninvadedness, have regained ownership and access to their ancestral lands and its natural resources that they are legally entitled to exploit for domestic purposes, for livelihood, what we call in Australia to get a feed. For a time in the late 20th century, when progressive ideas about land rights and self-determination were in vogue, and when the destructive impacts of enforced assimilation were still fresh in the minds of decision makers, a social movement of decentralization emerged and was supported that saw people leave large communities to return to a hybrid form of living in tiny communities, not dissimilar to highly flexible pre-colonial residence groups, which sometimes were referred to as bands. In terms of self-sufficiency and autonomy, many homelands and homelanders were a relative success in an Indigenous affairs environment in Australia that's littered with failure. But in the 21st century, after the supposed end of history and neoliberal triumphalism, the Australian state turned against homelanders. To give all this a materialist focus, this Indigenous social movement too readily exposed the fault lines in neoliberal market logic in remote Australia. And so in the current post-global financial crisis era of budget repair and austerity, rich Australia cannot apparently afford to support small scattered places. And so the political imaginary and machinery turns yet again to high modernist visions to develop the North and so develop the Aborigines, as measured by Western statistical indicators termed in Australia closing the gaps. And I think that some of the stories probably not dissimilar to some of the stories about development in North Quebec. There is an associated expectation that Indigenous lands will be abandoned and homelanders will be re-centralised to live permanently in larger townships, some abandoned by them 40 years ago. It's bad enough that people are hungry in these townships today, but in the recent past this was not the case when people had access to their country and its resources and hunted for livelihood. But modern hunting requires access to vehicles and guns and time and residence away from the townships, and these make-work programs tie people to the townships. All these requirements are being actively blocked by the Australian state, its programs and its agents in the name of progress. The state looks to eliminate the hunting lifeway, hunter-gatherer subjectivity. This is what Raphael Lemkin back in 1944 referred to as cultural genocide, the deliberate destruction of an ethnic group either by killing its individual members and or by undermining its way of life. Now I'll get back to Lemkin later. I just want to make it clear at the outset that elimination can occur via, and I quote, a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of the essential foundations of national groups. Now, in terms of the seminar, I sometimes conceptualise what I'm doing by thinking that I'm making a case of cultural genocide as an expert witness against Australian governments and their officials at some imagined future international criminal code. And this thinking is influenced by some recent work that I've done in the Australian federal court system and in court actions against the Australian government. So I do this imagined case by looking at 4 topics. Political discourse about homelands and homelanders, policy statements, a raft of program techniques for destruction, and how Aboriginal people, who I know well, say that they're experiencing these programs. I then look at theoretical framing and reflect briefly to end on pushback possibilities, but I won't say too much about that. We can look at that in discussion. So let me start by trying to give a little bit of context, and I call this contextual setting dots in the landscape. And I might just see if I can, I don't know if I can reach across there. Yep. And I'll put up some slides. Okay. Terrific, thank you, Colin. So while I'm increasingly hesitant to engage in spatial and statistical picturing with all its Foucauldian implications, it is clearly very analytically powerful. Perhaps that's why it is such an adjunct of governmentality and seeing like a state. Now, the first summary map I put up just tries to say a little bit about what happened to Indigenous land ownership over time. From 1788, when the continent was owned and used by thousands of Indigenous residence groups, to 1965, when Aboriginal people owned no land besides the land that they held under individual freehold title, which some people did. But the people who could own land under individual freehold title had to be deemed as Australian citizens. And then there were other lands that they didn't own but were reserved to them as Crown lands for their use. But those lands were for Indigenous people who were deemed to be tribal and wards of the state. But what you saw in Australia by 1933 was quite a transformation in terms of land ownership, with a whole series of land rights acts under statute law. And I've referred to this as a land rights revolution. And since then, you've had the Mabo High Court judgment in Australia in 1992 that recognised native title in 1992, and passed in 1993 the Native Title Act, which allows Indigenous people to claim back land under a native title regime. Today, 43% of the Australian continent is under some form of Indigenous title, including what is called exclusive possession, which sort of is exclusive except doesn't let you exclude mining, and non-exclusive possession, which is shared with others. Now, to enjoy newfound rights in land and resources, Indigenous claimants, I think a little bit like in Canada, have to legally demonstrate continuity of traditions that might include maintaining my materialist orientation, subsistence use of the land's resources, as well as spiritual relatedness. And they must demonstrate continuity of connection that again requires using the land's resources for survival. It seems logical to me that as more and more land comes under some form of Indigenous title, more and more landowners will want to live on or enjoy access to their ancestral lands. Arguably, going back to their country is a logical extension of successful claim. Now, in the second map, I'll just say a little bit about the land holdings today, and I just, will summarise this very briefly. The reddish orange colour is land rights. The blue is where you've had a successful native title determinations that result in exclusive possession. And the yellow is where you have non-exclusive possession.
Since your colours are completely different from the map, is there a way you could talk about orange, black and pink?
Oh, okay. Sorry, I'm looking on the screen. Okay, yep. Black, red and yellow. Yeah. Where do we get this yellow?
I don't know. This is a problem with the system in the room here.
Okay. Excuse the jaundiced view. So that's just a map of land holdings, but again, I don't know how that'll look in colour, but hopefully the reason I use this notion of dots in the landscape is I want to add populations, and what I'm focusing here is what the Australian Bureau of Statistics calls discrete Indigenous communities. Now these are tiny communities. There's about 1,200 of them in Australia, and 1,000 of them have less than 100 people each. And those places are the homelands where people have gone back to live on their land. And I think that just to give you a sense of scale, I wanted just to overlay Australia over North America, just to give you a feel for the sort of size we're talking about. And I think Australia is more or less the size of continental United States. Now these little dots, which I can go back to, have a population of less than 100 people each. They've historically been defined as small decentralised communities of close kin established by the movement of Aboriginal people to land of social, cultural and economic significance to them. We actually have very limited information about these places. the Australian government stopped collecting information about them in 2006, over a decade ago, when it stopped funding a census-linked survey about these places. Back then, in 2006, there were about 1,000 of these places, 560 in the Northern Territory, with an estimated population of about 10,000 and an average of 18 people per dot, so you get the idea of scale. And Western Australia had about 230 of these places with an estimated population of 5,000, an average of about 23 per dot. The importance of focusing on those two jurisdictions is that between them they account for about 80% of the dots and about 80% of the homelanders. And so most policy focus has been on those two jurisdictions. And just to make it clear, my focus today is on about 20,000 Indigenous people who are linked to about 1,000 places, mainly on Indigenous title lands, and they account for less than 5% of the current estimated Indigenous population of 800,000, according to the latest census, which represents just 3.3% of the total Australian population of about 25 million people. Just a very brief history of the Homelands social movement. In 2006, I wrote a paper in search of an outstation policy for Indigenous Australians. Note my emphasis on people, not places. In that paper, I noted that there has only been one serious attempt by the Australian government to look at this issue in a landmark parliamentary inquiry called Return to Country, the Aboriginal Homelands Movement in Australia, in 1987. That inquiry was complete 15 years after the modern movement started in about 1972. It was conducted over a 2-year period, and it was thorough in a manner unimaginable in Australia today. I provided 2 submissions to the inquiry and expert evidence to the inquiry. Return to Country was progressive and constructive and established the policy architecture for governments to assist homeland living. That was 30 years ago. There's been nothing like this inquiry since. A synopsis of the report runs something like this. The Homelands movement was seen as one of the most significant developments in Aboriginal affairs, an Aboriginal-initiated movement that clearly demonstrated the desire of Aboriginal people to assert control over their lives by establishing communities that are better attuned to their needs. It represented a concerted effort by Aboriginal people to leave larger places and reoccupy their traditional lands. The movement was seen in terms of relationship to land that had been disrupted by colonial processes. At the time, in 1987, it was estimated that there were 588 homeland communities with a total population of 9,500. Presently, the committee believed the numbers of homeland places and people would grow in the future. The multi-party committee made 58 recommendations with no dissenting views. I want to highlight just a few pertinent to my argument here, bearing in mind the committee's overarching assessment about the positive nature of the movement. The 2 most significant blocks of recommendations, 10 each, related to funding and education. On the former, it was recommended that homelands be equitably supported by all levels of Australian government. And like here, there's 3 levels: federal, state, provincial and local. On education, it was recommended that there be a high degree of consultation with homelanders about the nature of educational delivery and curriculum materials, training for local teachers, visitation by professionals, proper resourcing, use of new and alternate technology, vocational training, adult education, a veritable feast of enlightened largesse. It is now well documented that homelands were never properly resourced as recommended. They were subject of intergovernmental fiscal bickering and general neglect. Nonetheless, they persisted under the protective funding umbrella provided by the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, which was a national Indigenous representative and funding agency that operated from 1990 to 2004. Despite the Return to Country parliamentary inquiry, there's never been any comprehensive policy for residents of these remotest places, in part because governmental machinery is only attuned to thinking about stable places and populations, not tiny places with hypermobile populations. In some ways, homelands are extra-governmental spaces, and this suited many of the homelanders who wished to avoid state surveillance and so deployed what James Scott has referred to as the art of not being governed. Let me just move on now to talk about homelands as, in inverted commas, cultural museums, the discursive power of words. With the demise of ADSIG, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, in 2004, a process that had been overseen by the then Federal Minister, Amanda Vanstone, homelands became vulnerable to the new approach in Indigenous affairs in Australia, referred to as the new mainstreaming, or normalisation, or neo-assimilation. Homelands became caught up almost emblematically in these policy shifts, fuelled by culture wars and history wars at a time of growing Euro-nationalistic fervour in Australia. A speech that Amanda Vanstone gave, termed Beyond Conspicuous Compassion, Indigenous Australians Deserve More Than Good Intention, that was the name of the speech, that subsequently got much airplay on national radio and was even published by the peer-reviewed Australian National University Press 2 years later, was illustrative of how much thinking had changed in the 20 years since the earlier Return to Country report. The Vanstone speech was about Indigenous Australians in remote Australia generally, but it was her use of the term cultural museums twice that really titillated the media and angered Aboriginal people. The just abolished Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission that managed less than half of the Commonwealth's programs in Indigenous affairs was accused of setting Indigenous people up for failure. At the very heart of Vanstone's discursive assault on homelands was her faux discovery that there were 1,000 communities with less than 100 people each, something that was obviously well known in government circles. Suddenly, concern was raised that homelands might be risky environments, particularly for women and children, even though, and I quote her, some might be doing okay and helping with drug rehabilitation and maintenance of culture. Signalling the early days of the re-emerging discursive trope concerned with the safety and well-being of the child, reminiscent of the stolen generations in Australia, and turned into an art form during the Northern Territory intervention 18 months after the speech, Vanstone articulated her concerns that kids need a decent education and should make the choice for themselves. And I quote her verbatim, "And if they want to live in a traditional lifestyle in a remote area, good luck go to them. But they should have the choice to say, no, I want to go on and be a doctor or a lawyer. You know, Aboriginal kids aren't dumb. They're as smart as anyone else. And we should deliver education standards the same, and we should expect the same back." That's the transcript. That's in her words. I continue. "Our job is to make sure that when the kid's 20, he really does have a genuine choice about whether he wants to go to the city and be a doctor or a lawyer or a plumber, or whether he wants to stay in his homelands. And not giving him that choice, not having educational standards at that level is consigning that kid to a cultural museum for the benefit of, you know, the Chardonnay drinking commentators. I don't know if you have that terminology here, but it's quite common in Australia. That was Indigenous Affairs Minister Amanda Vanstone speaking with Alexandra Kirk on a significant ABC Radio National show on the 9th of December 2005. In making these comments, Vanstone represents herself as the champion of saying what needs to be said, unhampered by political correctness. Like Indigenous activists and public intellectuals, Noel Pearson and Marcia Langton, and anthropologist Peter Sutton. But she makes her brave policy interjection at an interesting time, after ADSIG has been abolished, not before. She makes no mention of what is successful at homelands, even though briefed with much evidence of the vibrant livelihoods eked out by some in the remotest and most difficult of places. And her trope of the trouble of culture is picked up by the media and by Indigenous commentators, but it's also picked up by anthropologist Peter Sutton, who turns his hand to policy. In July 2009, when promoting his book, The Politics of Suffering, on national television and radio, and discussing outback ghettos where people are trapped, Sutton uses this language. If maladapted culture is perceived and presented as the problem limiting people's progress to modernisation and development, as Sutton put it, and culture is strongest at homelands and among homelanders, then clearly something has to be done about that situation. So let me move briefly now from those just vignettes of policy scripts to the relentless aim of advancement to integration. 2 decades after the celebration and tolerance and limited support for homelands based on the report Return to Country, policy shifts dramatically to hostility and the threat of neglect. This matches in part the changing overarching policy frame that has shifted markedly from a form of self-determination, as allowed by the Australian state, to a form of what William Davies recently termed punitive neoliberalism. Let me turn briefly to some policy documents and see what they have to say about homelanders and homelanders living on country. In 2008, after the national apology, the Rudd federal government established the Closing the Gap policy framework under the Council of Australian Governments umbrella. This is a coalition between federal and state provincial governments. In the context of this framework, homelands were always going to be deeply problematic. How could statistical gaps, as measured by standard social indicators, ever be closed in these smallest and remotest situations? Embedded in the National Indigenous Reform Agreement, signed by these 2 levels of government, are a set of national investment principles in remote locations. That's a direct quote, national investment principles in remote locations. Indigenous peoples' cultural connections to homelands, whether on a visiting or permanent basis, are recognised, but policy indicates that expectations of government expenditure, so-called investments, in service provision, where there are few economic or educational opportunities, should be avoided, and voluntary mobility by individuals and families to areas where better education and job opportunities exist should be facilitated. In 2013, the new Abbott Conservative government introduced its Indigenous advancement strategy with all its evolutionary connotations, with the objective of achieving real results in the key priority areas of getting kids to school, adults into work, and building safer communities. This was the oft-repeated mantra of Tony Abbott, the self-ordained, short-lived Australian Prime Minister for Indigenous Affairs. This approach is highly disconnected from remote Australia and augurs dangerously for homelanders, because at many homelands there are no schools and no jobs, and community safety is not an issue. Although as homelands are concocted as risky environments, then high policy scrutiny is required. There is not much room in this policy framework for mobile and highly flexible hunter-gatherer subjectivity, living on the land and using its resources for a distinct form of lifeway. To effectively implement purported broad policy objectives, to close the gaps, to ensure advancement to integration in late capitalism, as the Indigenous Advancement Strategy dictates, might well require the elimination of those smallest dots on the landscape. So let me move very quickly to say something about ghettoization for reprogramming hunter-gatherer subjectivity. At the heart of this new approach is a reinvigorated state project that looks to re-centralise homelanders as during the colonial assimilation era. The Commonwealth approach is to coercively move people up the settlement hierarchy to larger places to oversee the reprogramming of their subjectivity to match that of mainstream neoliberal subjects. It is replicated by the approaches of Northern Territory and Western Australian governments. Homelanders, and especially the minority who live at homelands year-round, are confronted by a double jeopardy. On one hand, governments are looking to unilaterally break the late 20th century social compact to assist homelands, preferring to now redefine these places as private places, a little bit like a family farm. On the other hand, there are emerging legal and administrative requirements to centralise. Even though, as I'll demonstrate with ethnographic material, such proposed ghettoization from an Indigenous perspective might dramatically reduce life chances and eliminate ways of life to live as hunter-gatherers intergenerationally. And what I've just put up in a very summary form here, and I'll just leave this up for you to look at, I won't go into great detail, is just the elements of the Indigenous Advancement Strategy and the actual techniques proposed by government, and then my interpretation of what this is code for in relation to homelands. The current suite of programs based on paternalism and punishment is looking to re-centralise homelanders for surveillance, to ensure the reprogramming of their subjectivity to match that of mainstream citizens, to violently and belatedly eliminate the native, as Patrick Wolfe, who wrote a lot about settler colonialism, put it. The problem is that there is no evidence that the overarching goal to close the gap is actually working, even on the state's own statistical terms. And yet the state persists, because not to persist is to tolerate a homelander refiguring of the state and capitalism to particular very different ends. And not to persist highlights the failure of the expensive multi-billion, decade-old project to close the gap that year after year we're told by government is actually failing to succeed. Let me move now to say a little bit about forms of indigeneity and subjectivity critical to being Kuninjku. if you like, the view from the bottom up. What I want to do next is to describe how these approaches operate as a suite of economic techniques to extinguish the hunter-gatherer subjectivity of homelanders and so eliminate them as a social group. I do so from my fieldwork observations in Western Arnhem Land with Kuninjku speaking people. And these are people, you know, with whom I've worked now since 1979. And just to show you a slightly different map, this is a map of, you can just see there's a locational map there in Australia. And this is a map of Western Arnhem Land. And again, I won't go into great detail on the map except to say that the little dots are outstations, the bigger words are languages that are spoken there. And a place there you'll see called Maningrida is the government township that was established there only in 1957. And that township was established with the clear intent to centralise Aboriginal people in that region, to reprogram them for eventual assimilation. But that state project, which was sort of a form of state capitalism, basically failed. And so instead of remaining in the township, Indigenous people went back to live on their homelands, and they entered that sort of informal social compact I've referred to with a then more progressive state that allowed them to live partially supported at outstations. They sort of traded being a form of second-class citizen or citizen minus in exchange for being allowed to live relatively autonomously on their lands. And I use this group as an exemplar of the experience of homelanders for a variety of reasons. I know them well. They've created a form of hybrid economy, post-colonial, that worked well for them. And in recent years, I've had opportunity to work with them quite intensely, particularly collaborating with a skilled linguist and interpreter, Murray Guard. So a lot of our work's been done in the vernacular. So in a series of interviews with Kuninjku people about how they perceived the good life, I was surprised how closely my interpretation of their circumstances in terms of structure and agency sort of matched, particularly in relation to this way of living that Kuninjku had adopted, of living between a township and homelanders. The interesting thing for me was that Kuninjku people gave much more self-critical focus to agency over structure. And I won't go into great detail because I haven't got time about the interviews that Murray and I conducted most recently early this year. But let me just say a few things from their perspective, weaving the statements of a number of interlocutors into one narrative. And this is speaking on behalf of Kuninjku people. People are deeply concerned that the government keeps changing the rules. They're also aware that their representative and service delivery organisation called Bawananga seems to have changed, doing what the government wants, now operating as an employment and training provider. Why, people ask, did the government rules change, and why did they make Bawananga, their organisation, do what the government wants rather than work with Kuninjku? People are well aware that the government wants them to stay in the township. They've built houses in the township to attract people in. People are deeply worried about the constant pressure for the new generation, the young, to move to Maningrida, to adopt Balanda ways and to forego Kuninjku ways. They're deeply concerned about the new generation stuck in Maningrida, developing a taste for Western foods from the store. We are the last generation to eat bush tucker, but the children today, they're not used to eating bush food. If you stay here in Maningrida, you do not learn about anything about your country and how to gather food from it. You only think about chicken and Balanda food. That's white people's food. When people come to Maningrida, they become like Balandas. Today, people of this generation are not really standing on the ground, their ancestral land. They do not tread upon the ground with the same confidence. Kuninjku are well aware that the new Work for the Dole scheme introduced in 2015, that's 2 years ago, means less income and greater risk of being financially penalised for not turning up for work every day, Monday to Friday. They're well aware that Bawinanga, that we may call a political and economic institution, is of fundamental importance to the operation of their hybrid economy, that mixed transfer payments, arts income and returns from hunting, and that this organisation has been drastically weakened. Most do not want mainstream forms of paid employment, although some, working as rangers or in the arts, do. They're aware of emerging inequalities, how some young people get jobs, especially as rangers, with access to vehicles and guns and game. But such emerging inequalities are effectively resisted with the maintenance, even intensification of sharing. We must never refuse any request from family. We must give to them every time. People mainly speak their own language, and they're reluctant to send their children to school in Maningrida, where all teaching is in English and where parents and dogs are not welcomed. They're subject to an Indigenous-focused income management scheme, but this does not worry them much. They share food and they share tobacco, a substance whose purchase with welfare is restricted by the state. I could go on, but my aim here is to juxtapose the more abstract perspectives evidenced in policy statements and program logics with the lived reality and views of the people with whom I've worked for several decades, living at homelands, in a township and in between in Arnhem Land. Kuninjku are being corralled into town for reprogramming, for norms and values modification, using the Western logic of simplistic behavioural economics. And I note with some dismay that Richard Thaler won the Nobel Prize for Economics last week, a well-known behavioural economist. But they're resisting this pressure. Some live at homelands still. Others move between the homelands and Maningrida, or even into drinking camps in Darwin. Even as the state is looking to eliminate a form of transformed post-colonial hunter-gatherer living, Kuninjku people can see precisely what is being proposed. They can see that to lose contact with their land and their hunting traditions and their ethics of familial sharing will undermine what is critical to their notions of indigeneity, what it means to be Kuninjku. Now, I'll just very quickly, because I know I'm running out of time, whip through just a few slides to give you just a bit of a feel for what I'm talking about. That's just a real statement of, state domination. E2R Maningrida Police Station. Elizabeth II Regina doesn't mean very much to Kuninjku people, and this is their response to this sort of domination. This is just a picture I think I had on before of a hunting camp. This is just a hunter who I started working with in 1979, Johnny Moungel, with just giving you a feel for the hunting economy. Just a picture of him today holding a book that I wrote about their hunter-gatherer economy in 1987. Just people harvesting buffalo, almost as tasty as moose.
That's very diplomatic.
Hunting buffalo today and harvesting. I'm sure that these are similar scenes to what you see here in northern areas.
What birds are those?
Magpie geese, yeah. Just burning the country, managing the country with fire. And then just an element of engagement with capitalism. Johnny Moungel as a young hunter, and some of his more significant paintings from his late career when he went to France and painted the Musée Quai Branly and met Jacques Chirac as a cultural ambassador for Australia. And then a picture of him back in Maningrida today, back in his camp. Let me move very quickly now just to say something about Raphael Lemkin and the outback down under. I now want to discuss my intellectual shift from framing what is happening at homelands by using anthropology of development to explain this process of elimination through reference to a framework known as the Colonial Genocide School, based on the ideas of the founder of the Genocide Project, Raphael Lemkin, not the Genocide Project, but analysing the Genocide Project. I've sort of changed my orientation recently for two reasons. Firstly, is the threshold issue of intentionality. So in Australia, there's a great deal of resistance to talk about genocide because, you know, genocidal outcomes are often interpreted as being unintended consequences of government policy. But to my mind, there is now a clear willingness of those in power, be they white or black, to sacrifice homeland or hunter-gatherer subjectivity to placate corporate and state interests. This project is camouflaged in various ways, including as being for the utilitarian benefit of Australian society. But in my view, the project, as I've tried to quickly outline, is unmistakable. Second is my recent engagement over the summer holidays with the genocidal, the colonial genocide oeuvre, sparked by reading Philippe Sands's book East-West Street on the origins of genocide and crimes against humanity. Underpinning this opening of my mind, to the notion of genocide has been a growing awareness of the deeply destructive impacts of the technologies being deployed in pursuit of biocultural assimilation. I'm reminded here of a quote attributed to John Maynard Keynes, but likely first stated by the American economist Paul Samuelson. Well, when events change, I change my mind. What do you do? The same can be said for theoretical framing. When one no longer makes sense, when a theoretical framing no longer makes sense, surely one looks for another theoretical framing. And in the interests of time, I won't say anything about my theory of development approach, which I've used in the past, but instead just turn to say a little bit about the Colonial Genocide School, which in Australia has generally been deployed by historians and looking at the past, not the present. It says a great deal about the disciplinary division of labour in the neoliberal academy that I've missed much of this literature, probably because it is history and not anthropology or development. I note that the Australian historical scholars, and especially Damien Short, are far more familiar with my work than I am with theirs, at least till recently, which seems like very uneven intellectual exchange. Now, Short in some of his writings suggests that genocide, like Patrick Wolf's earlier notion of invasion as an ongoing process, is genocide in Australia is an ongoing process that in an Australia that has failed to decolonise. Now, Raphael Lemkin, in his seminal book Axis Rules in Occupied Europe, identifies genocide as a total social practice that comprises various techniques of group destruction. I've focused here mainly on economic techniques that look to extinguish hunter-gatherer subjectivity. What strikes me about much of this writing is that genocidal practice is theorised as a coordinated plan of different actions that attacks groups with the aim of annihilating them. As Short notes, Lemkin has often been misrepresented as defining genocide in terms of mass killing, whereas in fact it can occur in other ways. The destruction of the cultural patterns of a group, including its traditions. Lemkin wrote of genocide as having two phases: the destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed group and the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor. Defund the homelands, destroy the homelanders, violently impose the norms of neoliberal subjectivity based on a premeditated plan. He also noted, we should not overlook that genocide is a problem not only of war, but also of peace. Despite principles of territorial self-determination, certain groups may be obliged to live as minorities within the boundaries of other states. Now, I need to further I need to give further consideration to how this framework might give greater analytic insight into the processes I've described here. What has astonished me, and again I'll just put this up for you to look at, what has astonished me in my work to date is the similarity in techniques of genocide in various fields traced by Lemkin in 1944 to what I'm observing in Arnhem Land today. And I'll leave that there for you to look at just while I very briefly conclude. So concluding comments. There is an emerging powerful ideology of the rational legal Australian settler state that is both condoning and underwriting the doing of structural violence to homelanders. The technical processes for doing so are structurally intentional. Homelanders are being subjected to multiple jeopardies. Historically, they entered into an informal social compact that saw them receive minimal state support, living in largely ungoverned spaces that allowed them the freedom to maintain a modern form of hunter-gatherer subjectivity, even as they engaged in hybrid forms of livelihood. Then, as the state apparatus imagined that the conduct of unruly homelanders needed to be closely scrutinised and governed, a set of strategies was put in place to again centralise homelanders in larger places, depicted as more conducive to development, where their conduct could be monitored and modified. What has perhaps been most insidious is that in the name of citizenship inclusiveness, since the late 20th century, homelanders have become more and more dependent on the state. Now the terms of that dependence are being unilaterally altered by the state, so that homelanders are increasingly vulnerable to the state project to refashion their norms and behaviours, deploying techniques of punitive neoliberalism and behavioural economics. At the same time, their representative organisations, from the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission to the regional homelands resource agencies, have been eliminated or defunded and effectively depoliticised. Now, what might homelanders do to counter the hegemonic project of creative destruction of their connection to their homelands and associated hunter-gatherer lifeways? How can culturally destructive state policies be challenged? What is the decolonising pathway out of what now amounts to a genocidal relationship? Now, I usually look to end my seminars on an upbeat note and with hope for the future. And I'll try and do that just with one slide, which shows me visiting people just in July of this year in Maningrida, two of my old colleagues who are hunter-gatherers now living in the township. But the avenues available to politically disempowered and economically hyper-marginal and highly state-dependent Aboriginal landowners looking to exercise a right to live on their ancestral country and make a living off that land appear in the present very limited. I wonder how the economic hybridity predicated on the maintenance of hunter-gatherer subjectivity that some of these people were able to deploy for 30 years can resist the current project of elimination. Yet optimistically, such an economic formation might be of crucial survival value in a post-capitalist world. Perhaps the homelanders' struggle can build alliances with others living precariously and so spark a wider struggle for economic and social justice. Or might human rights in domestic or international law be mobilised to counter what is effectively an attempt of eviction from homelands? So today I will not end optimistically, but instead defer and leave the last words to Raphael Lemkin from Axis Rules. And I quote him directly. "In the situation as it exists at present, there is no means for providing for alleviation of the treatment of populations under occupation until the actual moment of liberation. It is then too late for remedies, for after liberation they can at best only obtain only reparation of damages, but never restoration of those values which have been destroyed and which cannot be restored. So thank you, and sorry I've gone on a bit long.
The floor is open to questions. We have about 25 minutes, so please do quickly ask your questions.
I just have a general question about the application of the idea of genocide. And I mean, without, I wonder whether one, I mean, I think what I've learned from your talk is that there's a sense that one of the things that you learn about previous genocides, the European, the Holocaust, is also a kind of eradication of a whole way of being, right? Because you know, under the physical, the part that doesn't carry forth as mass killing. So I mean, you know, we usually think of genocide as a certain particular modern form of mass killing, which we're not seeing here. I mean, obviously, I'm not at all, you know, in any way minimizing you know, the murderous intent of a settler state, but in any way here in Australia or in North America. But I just wonder what you lose also. I mean, there was, you know, the particular modern form of genocide, which I mean, there are others before that, of course, Armenian genocide, but there's a particular model of the Holocaust has a particular kind of bureaucratic and modern formation that I don't know how, you know, I wonder whether, I don't know, I mean, this is an open, you know, I know that genocide is used a lot in these contexts, so it's really an open question for discussion, really. It's something I'm not clear. Of course, I also extend it in my own thinking to ideas like ecocide, which I think has, you know, which is an important, there's also an important term, but there's also some slippage there as well. So I just thought you might reflect on that a little bit.
Yeah. Look, I think ecocide, and I think a lot of the people who now write about cultural genocide also write about ecocide, and Damien Short's obviously one. And people also talk about ethnocide. But I guess, you know, what I've tried to do is and I suppose that's why I've avoided this notion of genocide in my own work historically, is that emotive response. This is all about the Armenian Holocaust. This is all about the, you know, the Holocaust during the Second World War. But when I went back and read Lemkin more carefully, you know, what I saw was that his project, you know, was trying to not to draw a distinction between physical mass killing and cultural elimination. And he did that, not just going back to, of course, the Armenian genocide, but going back to many previous genocide where groups had been eliminated through incorporation into nation states. And so I guess, you know, I just found this to be a framework that I found very, very helpful in understanding what's going on in the present. And you know, the very surgical preciseness of these techniques in the Australian context seemed to me to just conjure notions of intentionality. And that intentionality, you know, it's not that we're not informed in Australia about the impact of assimilation practices. Only several decades ago, you know, which were, you know, basically discredited in the 1970s, and yet, you know, just 20 or 30 years later, we see a return to those, to that same broad approach, but using much more precise techniques to eradicate unacceptable forms of hunter-gatherer living. And so really what I feel, that confronted by this evidence base of discourse, policy, and precise programs and techniques, I just don't see a difference between what was being documented in the 1940s and what's happening today. And of course, I want to call this out now. I don't want to, in 20 years' time, then look back and say, yes, this was successful in eliminating these people. Although I must say that in the present, and again, these things are very hard to document, but I can see people's health status declining. I can see their psychological health declining. I can see people in places like Maningrida having a life expectancy for males of probably now in their early 50s and probably declining in terms of life expectancy. And I can certainly see, even using official statistical information, that their poverty is becoming more entrenched. And I can document that they are getting less to put in their mouths to sustain themselves. So the similarities are just chilling. And so in some ways it is a provocation to use that term, but I don't want to get involved also in Australia in historical debates about was it genocide historically. What I want to assert is that it's genocide today, and let's argue about that. Yeah. Oh.
Sorry. I mean, John, are you aware that they, in the Truth and Reconciliation report, they did use the term cultural genocide in 2005 here?
In Canada, yeah.
And the reaction was really, I mean, people were quite shocked but a really interesting conversation around the term, over the last few years that might be of interest to you to follow up.
Look, I'm actually aware that again, in scholarly discussions, people in Canada and the States are much more comfortable with using that terminology of cultural genocide. But in Australia, there's just this knee-jerk reaction. You cannot use that language.
Well, it was pretty good. I think people were quite surprised at it. It was a good decision. I mean, it really did get the attention that they were after. Yeah. But it didn't sit easily with people.
Yeah, I'll go back and read that report, and also it'd be very useful to cross-reference in the writing I'm doing. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So what determines that a group or a family or a person decides to be a homelander or decides to move to the city and to become a mainstream Australian? Also, are there different groups? Can we have different people in the same group, in the same family, having those different strategies? Do they collaborate? And also, are there some hybrid situation where you play both, like being during a season homelander, then doing seasonal job in the city? Do they use the welfare? I mean, are there some sort of hybridization and mixed strategies involving then being a homelander, but also something else?
Yeah, look, not many examples. There's obviously some, and so in some ways, what I try to do, in just this particular case, was say a little bit about that mixed strategy and hybridization in a township, where some people did get work as employed as rangers, and you're having access to guns and vehicles and looking after their family. So those strategies are being deployed, but what they're doing is still requiring people to work in a particular way that I think people who want to maintain their connection to their country, retain their ancestral connections, realise is going to eliminate that way of living. So it's a centralised way of living, and it can assist survival, but it still delivers to most people a currently destructive way of living. Okay, and in you know, so I'm talking about that small group of people who want to maintain living on the land. There are obviously people further up the settlement hierarchy living in townships who might migrate for employment. But the general evidence in Australia is that if you migrate from a remote community up the settlement hierarchy for employment and livelihood, you're more likely to fail than if you stay at home. So it's not that opportunity for people who migrate for labour is really likely to result in success. But again, there's some exceptions. You know, some exceptional individuals might get work in the mining industry and earn a lot of money, and there might be a remittance economy. But this is not really a successful model in the Australian context, and it doesn't really allow people to maintain, you know, that particular way of life that, you know, I just want to make it quite clear, I'm not talking here about, you know, maintaining pre-colonial hunter-gatherer subjectivity. This is already a transformed way of life, you know, where people have already got a hybridized way of living. You know, they're already engaging with the arts industry and working, you know, in as rangers and working as carbon farmers and being paid. You know, they're doing work for pay, but they just want to do it in a particular way that still allows them the freedom, you know, to move back to their land or backwards and forwards from their land, to live in a flexible, you know, fundamentally different way, which just isn't tolerated. And the pathway that's envisaged for them by the state is that if you do move to the city, you don't retain that flexible way of living. You become a neoliberal subject. You know, you buy a house, you settle down, you get a mortgage, you know, you get locked into a particular Western way of living. Yeah.
This is particularly interesting for me. I'm coming actually from the sociology department here at McGill, but I'm studying an indigenous population in the Mixteca region in Oaxaca, Mexico, who've recently been displaced from their land because of land reform, what have you, and are now migrants in Mexico. I struggle with this idea as well, where you talked about hybrid cultures, no longer being able to go back to their traditional way of life. Part of the genocide is that they've been robbed of their opportunity to keep a lot of their values in place and their lifestyle. My question that I struggle with too in my context is, what would you see as then the state's role? So we've concentrated a lot, for myself as well, on what isn't working. What do you see as some of the potential solutions? How can the state and populations outside of these communities work to establish and facilitate change for the better for these communities? So increased, however you wish to measure standards of living, so if it's in terms of life expectancy, mortality rates, or in terms of their own subjective measures. How do you see the state and populations outside of these communities as facilitating that?
Yeah, look, I think that's a really good question, and I guess part of my frustration is that, you know, for probably 20 years, you know, I advocated and empirically documented a development alterity that was working for people. And that was through this notion of it's something I call the hybrid economy model, where the state actually facilitates people having you know, diverse lifeways, you know, and the main thing that underpinned that was people getting a form of guaranteed minimum income that actually gave people you know, an income floor. But it also gave them the flexibility to build on that income floor through their choice of productive activity. And so part of the reason why I put up those photographs of someone like that artist Jon Altman is that he could simultaneously be a hunter, he could simultaneously be a artist engaging with, you know, global sort of global capitalist art markets. He could simultaneously be involved in land management. He's simultaneously involved in directing the burning of country to abate carbon and be paid for that work. So you just have the state being open to people having a suite of activities that they move in and out of flexibly, that accord with their notions of what's productive and valuable work, what returns them, importantly, income, both in terms of cash, but also in terms of food. You know, so non-cash incomes as well. And again, you know, one of the frustrating things is that there were state programs in Australia that actually managed to do that quite well. They still had enormous challenges in terms of finding people appropriate forms of housing, education delivery, healthcare. It's not easy to do with mobile populations. But again, historically, and especially coming out of that earlier inquiry, Return to Country, there were attempts at delivering those sorts of services flexibly, and you used to get a better engagement with the education system, better engagement with health services, better engagement, you know, with capitalism than you get today. You know, so it's like, you know, it's almost like now, you know, that way of you know, underwriting, you know, flexible ways of living that accorded with people's priorities is being jettisoned because it doesn't fit into a broader project, you know, being imposed on these people, okay? And as these people resist that imposition, what you're actually seeing is the results, you know, despite the rhetoric, just becoming more and more disastrous for them, and those options, you know, that suite of options that people had, which you know, again, without being romantic, you know, were highly dependent on maintenance of forms of indigenous cultural knowledge and ecological knowledge, you know, not dissipating. You know, so while, you know, this new process is going on, you know, those possibilities for different ways of living are just being eradicated, and so it wouldn't be hard for the state in the short term to tweak their policy framework to support these different hybrid productive ways of living. But if they maintain their current policy regime, I think that those ways of living could be quite quickly eliminated. And in some ways, you know, what's interesting about that is how Aboriginal people during the assimilation era were able to resist the state, you know, with greater success than I think that they will be able to today, because of their growing consumer dependency and their growing dependency on the state for welfare. So, you know, their historic forms of resistance that saw them have this, coming out of the colonial period and having a period of post-colonial possibility, won't necessarily survive if you have, which will inevitably happen, the state recognising that neo-assimilation will fail, and then we'll have another phase of post-colonial possibility, but will people be able to reactivate what they had? And I think again, that's partly what makes me want to adopt this notion of genocide, because, you know, in the past, other things were possible to come out of that colonial period, but now I think the extinguishment aim is much more final, you know, and this is, again, I think something that people themselves are recognising, you know, that their ability to resist is greatly diminished.
Nina and Jon,
yep.
5 minutes.
5 minutes.
Yeah, and I'll try and respond quickly.
First, thank you so much for this really, really interesting presentation. I learned so much. But I was really struck by, so you're taking up historians, and then you bring in this economic dimension as well. But I was also thinking about, you sort of hint bits and pieces about law. And I noticed it throughout the presentation of bits and pieces about legislation. But what this talk of genocide made me think about all the legal scholarship that talks about genocide, this category, in large part genocide in terms of this writing about war crimes, which I realize is a bit different from what you're looking at, because that's, taking place at, a spot of conflict, but it does position itself as part of this larger narrative. But I was also, you sort of hint at, international law a bit, and also up here, there's discussion of the abolition of customary law as well.
Yes.
So I was wondering if this is a facet that's sort of left, that you're going to explore in the future,
yes.
or if that's sort of not your project, but I found it really interesting.
Yeah. No, it's a big part of my project. I want to engage with lawyers, and that was part of my hinting at the beginning about the International Court of Law. But obviously my possibility is probably greater in Australia in appealing to our federal court and high court system, because that right to enjoy your native title rights is now increasingly recognised by the courts in Australia. And so if you can demonstrate as we've had in sub-Saharan Africa, that people are actually being forced off their land, then you may have a compelling case for the courts to deem that government action is racially discriminatory or compensable, or just needs to end. So it's definitely part of my project, and I'm very keen in Melbourne to engage with legal scholars. That's the next phase of my project in a way. I'd like to really get human rights lawyers involved in this, and certainly, again, just very specifically about some of these practices. I'm certainly advocating that, for instance, what they're doing with these compulsory work for the dole schemes that target Indigenous Australians are a modern form of slavery. And I'm trying to engage with the whole global movement against modern forms of slavery, and Australia's at the forefront of that critique. But then the numbers in Australia that are living under modern forms of slavery have actually escalated. So I'm trying to use that language as well. But some of the very highly qualified international human rights lawyers I've tried to engage with are very reluctant to join the project to date. But I'm going to recruit a few.
So, in the indigenous area of Africa I work in, people were absolutely delighted when, a few years ago, when they made primary education universal and free. Here was their moment, put their kids in, etc. But the notion of that education is basically intrinsic to cultural genocide is, I think, really worth thinking deeply about. What I'm trying to grapple with in your argument is whether, in fact, it's intrinsic and it's universal. When that occurs, it will enact cultural genocide on Indigenous peoples wherever, simply because the structure of education changes thought patterns, involves other languages, etc. Or whether it's a more focused argument that would say, under certain conditions, it has certain outcomes which are undesirable, and you seem to be suggesting that 10 years or 20 years ago, before, they had a much more sensible policy in that, and also in direct support for people to live on the land, etc. What is your argument? My intrinsic belief that education has this universalizing quality of enlarging the human spirit, etc., and it's intrinsically good, is brought up against this very, very sober claim that it's really, for Indigenous people at least, it's cultural genocide. Or is your argument somewhat more nuanced, and you're saying, for instance, education can be mobile. It can follow the people. Education can be divided between a more general language and a local language. It can draw from the knowledge of people and basically work Indigenous types of knowledge into the curriculum,
yes,
as well as other types of science,
yes,
etc.
Definitely the latter.
Yeah.
So again, just to, it's funny because I've had this debate in Australia publicly with somebody who accused me, a professor at a university, of being anti-education for Aboriginal people. So I had my reply, but I guess just to reply, very briefly and maybe concretely, I actually am a director of a philanthropy that supports a school, one of the most remote schools in Arnhem Land, called the Nawadakan Academy. It's only been going for a couple of years. It's bilingual, it's bicultural, it's highly successful. It's looking to give people skills to work, biculturally as rangers, deploying Western scientific techniques and Indigenous knowledge and ways of doing things. And so far, the attendance rate at this school is somewhere around 90%, whereas generally in remote Australia, the attendance rate is 50%. And we have no issues about, the model that's being used in Australia at the moment is if the kids don't turn up to school and the parents are on welfare, the parents will be penalised. Whereas at the Nawadakan Academy, firstly, there's no way they'd impose that sort of regime. But the evidence is, and there's evidence from other bicultural, bilingual schools in remote Australia, that if you deploy the right approach and have the right curriculum, you will get dependence and you will get the outcomes. But in the last decade, as part of the history wars and culture wars, we've seen the elimination of bilingual education. We've seen the imposition of a particular way of teaching that will just, it won't even, get the kids through the school gate, because it's, and there's this notion that somehow we can educate the kids, but that was my reference to people and dogs. And in Australia, in some of these remote communities, they literally have, 3 metre high fences around the schools with a gate to get in. And the argument is that they've got these huge fences around to keep the dogs out, But so it's definitely the latter. I'm not saying that education will inevitably be part of that elimination process if it's done right, but the way it's being done is highly destructive and being rejected. Yeah.
I think we have to let you go catch your flight, unfortunately, but thank you so much.
If anybody's got any questions, that I haven't addressed, just feel free to email me. I'm very email friendly and I do respond. Yeah.